I'm Ruth Bancewicz, the Faraday Church Engagement Director. Welcome to Faraday Churches. Our guest today is Reverend Professor David Wilkinson, who is a co-director of the Engaging Christian Leaders in an Age of Science project at Durham University, where he is a professor in the Department of Theology and Religion and was until recently principal of St John's College. His scientific background is in theoretical astrophysics, especially star formation, the chemical evolution of galaxies, and terrestrial mass extinctions. He also holds a PhD in systematic theology. And by the way, David, I think PhDs are like matter and antimatter and cancel each other out, but never mind.
I think that's right.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right about people with two PhDs. The high point of getting a second PhD was that Radio Newcastle devoted in my honor an afternoon of Dr. jokes. And I
Fantastic.
think that's the telling contribution that I've made to society in general, the excuse for a local radio station to tell Dr. jokes. So I think that's pretty good.
I need to remember that and keep that in my back pocket whenever I meet someone with two PhDs. That's fantastic. I love that. I'm after that introduction, David, is there anything else you want to tell us about yourself, apart from featuring on local radio in such a splendid fashion?
No, I'm in a phase of life, Ruth, where we've just had our first grandchild, and I have to tell you, it is the most wonderful thing. Um, I didn't imagine just how moving or how precious it is. Um, and particularly as we're coming up to Christmas, I was just with my granddaughter, Leah Grace, who's 6 months just yesterday, and thinking what an incredible thing. We were at a carol service singing about these hymns about the incarnation of God in Jesus, and thinking what fragility, what vulnerability God took on to become a babe in arms. Um, Quite astonishing. And but anyway, I'm being a granddad, and it's just great.
That's fantastic. And it's amazing how a lack of sleep deprivation means you can appreciate these wonders rather than must keep everyone alive, sort of survival instinct. You can reflect and enjoy time.
That's right. And I think as parents, we were so busy and so tired most of the time that actually, although we enjoyed immensely our kids, just now having a bit more time to enjoy has been great.
Right, great. Well, I'm looking forward to your reflections on the incarnation in a few minutes. But first of all, so you were one of those scientists who started as a scientist and then
Yes.
got ordained, and particularly in the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? What was that about?
Well, I mean, to be honest, in terms of, I just would say that I felt a call of God. And I wouldn't say that at any stage I felt unfulfilled or frustrated or cynical about science. I enjoyed science immensely. Mind you, I have to say I didn't enjoy it as much at school as I did at university. Um, I found physics at times at school very boring. You know, you do predictable experiments, you push wooden trolleys down benches and you time them, and didn't seem to me terribly imaginative or creative. Um, but undergraduate physics began in Durham with general relativity and quantum theory. Those were the first two courses. And you're introduced into a completely different world. I enjoyed the astrophysics, I enjoyed problem solving. And then I just felt the call of God upon my life, and I wasn't walking out of the physics department one day and saw a shower of cosmic rays lighting up the sky saying, David, you must become ordained or anything like that. It was simply as I said my prayers and read my Bible and talked within the church to people that I trusted, that I had a sense that the gifts God might have given me um, um, had a different context to be fulfilled than just being a professional scientist. Now, that was really important because I think to have the vocation of a professional scientist is a Christian vocation. There's not, becoming a theologian or a preacher or a missionary is not a higher vocation than being a scientist, a technologist, or an engineer. But I think sometimes God just asks us to work in different contexts. And that was why I felt a sense to at least go to the Methodist Church and say, I feel as if God's calling me to Christian leadership. Um, do you concur? Do you judge this to be the case or not? And for some strange reason, they said yes. And that led me off to study theology at Cambridge. Although I have to say, I was the type of person in those days who felt that I needed to get through the theology in order to become a church leader. That was a qualification that I needed to grit my teeth and get my way through. And what happened was I became interested in theology a little bit, not hugely, but the real interest in theology for me became in ministry as a church leader, as I tried to articulate the relevance of Jesus to people, as I tried to think about how do you plan about growing a church? How do you sit with someone at the point of death and say sensible, uh, biblical things to folk? That's where theology becomes really, really important. Often telling you, perhaps not what to say, but reminding you what not to say. And so it was out of that experience of church leaders and leadership and apologetics that my real interest in theology came about.
Yeah, and many people have appreciated your books and talks and broadcasts and all sorts of things since then. And there's so many questions I want to ask, but I'm going to stick to topic because this is an Advent
Right.
podcast. It's nearly Christmas. So the obvious question is, Christians believe that God became a human by becoming an embryo, developing in the womb, being born like anyone else. The framing of the title for this podcast is, I think, slightly northern grammar. I grew up in the north, you're in the north, so why not ask, what's a scientist doing believing in the incarnation?
And that's such a good question. And for me, the incarnation, first of all, is about evidence. So I became a Christian at the age of 17, partly because I began reading the New Testament. I'd not done that before. I just listened to what people had told me about the New Testament. And for me, centrally, the evidence of why I believe in God, and perhaps more importantly, what that God is like, is in the Christian claim that God became a human being and lived amongst us. And that actually God walking the space-time history of the universe is the evidence that God exists in the nature of God. Because if you ask me the question, what is God like? My answer as a Christian and as a scientist is he's like Jesus. Because I think the argument that says without God becoming a human being or self-revealing God's self, we cannot work God out with our finite human minds. So first of all, the incarnation actually leads me to belief, first of all. Now then the incarnation raises some really interesting questions as a scientist. The great hymn writer of the Methodist Church, Charles Wesley, has a lovely line in one of the hymns where he talks about the incarnation, our God incomprehensibly made man, he talks about. And there's a limit to, I think, how science can probe such an event as this. I do believe in the miraculous, not in terms of God breaking the laws of physics, which is what David Hume talked about, but God is the one who has freedom both within and beyond the laws of physics, his normal ways of working to do unusual things. And so for me, the physics and biology of the incarnation I think, is a one-off and probably doesn't have parallels to anything that we've discovered about um, the nature of embryology or indeed physics. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at the circumstances. And just as a physicist, there are certain things where I hold it on the basis of evidence. So, for example, Ruth, if you ask me as an astrophysicist, what is the dark energy, which makes up about 70% of the universe, I have no idea. I mean, I have no idea what 70% of the universe is made up of. Why do I believe it to be true? Well, because if you look at very distant supernova explosions, you see that the universe is accelerating. And the only explanation that makes sense for the accelerating universe is the existence that 70% of the universe is in dark matter. Now, as science progresses, we will find that out, what the dark energy is. Sorry, dark energy, not dark matter. But at the moment, I hold it because there's sufficient evidence from the observations. Now, when I look at the incarnation of Christ, I think there is very good historical evidence that Jesus was a human being who lived at a particular time. And I'm quite positive, actually, about the gospel accounts of his birth. Remember, both Matthew and Luke have different accounts of the birth of Jesus. I like that, by the way. I mean, I would be very worried if all the Gospels had exactly the same stories. And some of these stories are really quite odd. So, for example, if I was going to write a story of God becoming a human being, the first people I would have would be the religious leaders and the people of local power, the Romans, bowing down to this child who was born. Luke tells us the first witnesses were shepherds. I mean, shepherds were not renowned for their intellectual ability or their power in those days. And then he doesn't have local rulers, does Matthew? Matthew has some strange astrologers, wise men, kings from the east, which, if you're talking about a Messiah, that's very odd indeed. So there's a kind of what J.B. Phillips often talked about the Bible. It has a ring of truth about it because these stories are so odd. So I can't work out the physics or the biology of it, but I do think that there's historical evidence for this child being born in Bethlehem. And again, you see, that's very odd as well. I mean, Bethlehem was prophesied, but if you're going to have someone important, you have them born in Jerusalem, don't you? I mean, really, if you're going to write this story as a novel. So there's a historicity, a feel of historicity about this. And I think those who recorded the Gospels are recording things that perhaps they don't fully understand their significance, but are recording it anyway. Because if you're a Jewish religious thinker, you would know that the Old Testament is full of condemnations of astrology and reading things into the stars. So what do you record? A story which is about astrologers understanding the stars and leading them. I mean, this is really counterintuitive in
It
so many
worked for
different
them.
ways.
Yeah.
That's how it worked for them. And therefore, I think it has that sense that this really happened for me.
Yeah, 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 no, definitely. And as a biologist and someone who actually did develop into biology, I have reflected myself on the significance of the incarnation, knowing what I know about embryos. But what for you, well, as a physicist or a human being, what is the significance of what does the incarnation tell you as a
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ruth. And I think for me as a physicist, it's a reminder that God is committed to stuff. to the physicality of the universe. That's the first thing. So that God doesn't hover in Jesus 2 feet off the dirt of the ground. He actually is in the dirt of the ground. And a lot of our contemporary songs and older hymns pick this up of the child born in the manger in an outback corner of the Roman Empire, in the outhouse of a pub, in a way that was all about the kind of reality of everyday life and the physicality of the universe. So, first of all, I think this is a God who's committed to the stuff of creation. I find that an affirmation of my work as a physicist, that God becomes part of the universe, that the physicality of the universe isn't an optional extra for God. It's actually really important. And of course, that story from the incarnation through to the bodily resurrection of Jesus also emphasizes that, in that the empty tomb is empty because God transforms stuff, the physicality of the universe. So this is a long way from this kind of Greek dualism, which says that the body and the world are evil, and all that's good or God's interested in is the spirit or the soul of some kind of grayish, ghostly type of thing that lives within us. So that's the first thing. The second thing for me is this sense of revelation, so that, as John says, we beheld his glory, glorious of the only Son from the Father. So the incarnation is about revelation. It's about showing us what God is like. And I find that moving and profound, not just within my own life, but in terms of what Christian proclamation is about. We don't proclaim a really good idea about God. We proclaim a God who became incarnate amongst us. I think the third thing for me is also in John's account of the incarnation, which is called the prologue, which is when John talks about, and the Word became flesh and lived amongst us. And you can get the translation out of that of God pitched his tent with us. It's an extraordinary image. I mean, I to be honest, Ruth, I hate camping. And part of hating camping is having people in tents around you. I remember going to a Christian conference, and my wife convinced me that we should camp. And we pitched our tent in a very, very quiet corner of a field and thought we'll be all right. Came back to find our tent absolutely surrounded by other people's tents. People who, and this is no joke, would often be singing Kumbaya at midnight around the campfire. That is not my favorite song, and that's not my favorite time to sing. Now, God is the one who pitches his tent with us. There's a solidarity with human beings. There's a reminder of, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That God comes into flesh, into the world, in order to rescue us, to redeem us. So something about an affirmation of the whole of creation, something about the incarnation shows us what God is like, and something about the incarnation is God coming into our world, pitching his tent with us, not to condemn the world, as John would say, but that the world might be saved through him.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm nodding because I love this story, and hearing those affirmations is so encouraging, and particularly for those who are preaching on the incarnation in the next few weeks. They've got a lovely crib sheet from this podcast now, some great ideas. I wonder how many people adapt the tent image. But I grew up with this story. So I've never had the experience of just thinking the thought of God pitching his tent next to ours and thinking, heck, I don't know, like if I want that, and um,
Yes.
thinking of the stories of scientists who have, as adults, been confronted with, or at least for some reason or another, done an honest investigation or been open to some kind of experience or conversation about Christianity, or, out of a spirit of open-mindedness or looking at the data, what have you, and then thought, heck, hair standing on end, gut churning or whatever, what am I going to do? Because I think I'm going to have to take this seriously, and the repercussions are too many to think about. I don't know
Yes.
if you've had that experience or walked through that experience with people, what you would say to someone like that when they're sort of almost the reluctant, like C.S. Lewis, the reluctant
Yeah,
convert.
that's right. I think that's a very important insight, and I think then what we learn, and that sense of God pitching his tent with us, I think you're absolutely right, is challenging, worrying, unsettling, um, and that can be a profound, life-changing moment, and I've seen that in many people. And when I used to do, we all do, I think, carols by candlelight. And I once asked a very experienced church leader um, what he thought the value of carols by candlelight was. Um, and he said, it allows people to cry without being noticed. That actually there's something in the incarnation of a God who is with us that touches us at the deepest level emotionally and intellectually. But I think the other thing is that this is a child in a manger. Um, there is a humility about God's approach to us, which gives us genuine freedom to go and worship at the manger or to wander off. And so I think for me, that's embodied in the story of Herod and the visit of the Eastern astrologers, wise men, we don't too sure. If you remember, Herod's the one who feels threatened by this, who feels power and role is threatened by the birth of this child. For Herod, this is something to be suppressed in the most brutal ways. It happened later on with the killing of children. But this is a very different attitude of the kings from the East who, and Matthew uses the term, they worshipped. And I think this is where worship itself becomes really important during the Christmas period. Worship is not just, as you know, about singing little carols here and there and feeling a nice warm feeling. Worship is about our whole response, the offering of our gifts, the offering of our lives, the actual bowing down, taking the knee and acknowledging a greater power than ourselves. Now that can't be predicted in an algorithm. That's not a scientific judgment. Each of us carries our own story to the manger. Each of us takes our own issues of pain, hurt, self-identity, hopes, fears, all of that to the manger. And there's no one template for what the response will be. In fact, Scripture shows us lots of different people responding in different ways, some outrightly rejecting the birth of this child. And I think that's about the freedom that God gives us, that there's an overwhelming presence at one level, but it's also a God who, in humility, comes to us in the vulnerability of a child. And so Lewis did feel hounded by God. But there are others who have felt that Jesus simply stands at the door and knocks. And it's up to us whether we open that door. I was listening to a testimony last night in the carol service that I was attending. A really moving testimony by a young student worker in the church. And she said, I didn't believe in God. I just thought at the age of 16 I might try and pray, she said. So I did it. No, I wasn't sure what I was praying to. She said, it was almost as if I opened the door a crack to God and suddenly found that the door flew open. Now, I think it's up to us whether we're able to open that door a crack or not. What do you, I mean, what's your experience of this and those around you?
I mean, I think as life goes on, people who may have thought, I don't do the God thing, I don't need God, God doesn't exist, maybe meet people or have experiences that make them circle back, and at least in a more, not a great word, but more tolerant way or more open-minded way to their friends' faith. Or, I mean, 1 in 30% of people in labs in the UK, one survey showed biologists and physicists believe in some kind of God, at least some of
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
time. And
Absolutely.
part of my work is trying to remind people in churches that, scientists are not all about being anti-God, and it's not necessarily a life of terrible suffering being a Christian in science. But actually those conversations go on, and I think particularly midlife, in my age, I think people do, having, experienced um, some troubles or wondering about purpose or future. I mean, you
Yes.
use the line hopes and fears from that hymn, and I think
Yes.
that's when people maybe become a bit more open. And actually, that's one of the things I was going to ask you just to finish, was to think about. So the passage in John 1,
Mm.
which I was hoping this podcast would turn people's thoughts to. This is a lovely passage that actually a lot of scientists will gravitate to, because it talks about, in the beginning was the word, and another way of translating that, or the word in Greek is logos, and you think about logic and rationality, and that's a conversation that really appeals to scientists. But it's such a beautiful passage. I'm going to read just a few verses, if that's
Yeah.
right. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. There you go, from Cambridge, but not Carols from King's standard reading. But if you're advising a pastor, they're like, oh, I'm going to preach on this passage again. I know there's scientific people in my congregation, or maybe people bringing friends and family, husbands, wives, whatever, who are sciencey, and I just want to help them tackle this passage a bit. How would you advise those people who doing that?
Well, yeah, and it's a wonderful opportunity. So first of all, um, uh, grasp the opportunity, because many people, as you say, Ruth, will come at Christmas on the fringes. I think, secondly, don't overestimate in the UK today people's understanding of what the Christian faith is about. So actually, um, often, and I was a pastor for a number of years, often you get to Christmas and you think, oh, same old sermon. How can I make this new? How can I make this interesting? Actually, there's just something about talking about Jesus in a very simple, straightforward way that bears repeating. And I'm very ancient now, very old, and I've read a few theology books in my time. I don't want to go at Christmas and listen to some fantastic new take on the Christmas story. I just want to hear the story of Jesus. But then we move to the prologue, and I think you set it up beautifully. I think, first of all, understand the prologue from the background. And not only does it pick up the logos, the rationality, which is John picking up Greek thought at the time, it also, of course, picks up Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, the word in Hebrew thought is God's creative activity. So that's why in Genesis 1, and God said, and things were created. So what John is doing here is a wonderful thing. He's bringing together the sense that the scientific rationality behind the universe, the logos, is there because of the personal, creative agency, action of a creator God. So the word was in the beginning with God. But then that lovely sense, and I think particularly at the moment in terms of the world, that the life is given to all, but that the light that God gives, even in the darkest of times, is not overcome, is not extinguished. That's because God is the creator of all things. That God has not given up on the universe. In Palestine and in Israel, in Ukraine and Russia, in the many other areas where the light seems to be almost extinguished, Christians hope, but hope in a way that's based on the creator God who created all things. So God hasn't given up on this universe. Now, how God works through such things are way beyond me. Why God chose to work through a child in a stable in Bethlehem is way beyond me. But what I see in that child being born is the word becoming flesh and live amongst us. That gives me the confidence that the light will not be extinguished. So embrace the opportunity, I think. Don't try and overestimate or be too clever with the sermon or what you're preaching. But third, remember that this is about a God who created all things, who loves all people, and has purposes for all things, because he's the creator God who doesn't give up on this universe. And ultimately, we see that in Jesus. The other interesting thing is in that passage, just after the verses that you read, is that John goes into a little bit of an excursus about John the Baptist. And sometimes in carol services, we don't read that because it takes a long time. So we jump from those opening verses right through to God became a human being and lives amongst us. But the presence of John the Baptist in the prologue is really important because it's an affirmation of human beings' role to witness to this cosmic event. That this isn't just about a God who works his purposes out by becoming incarnate, This is a God who gives Christian people the opportunity to witness to others about Jesus. This was John's role. And in fact, as John's gospel then develops, you get a whole number of witnesses um, uh, witnessing to the reality that we see in Jesus. And one of I think the most powerful things in carol services, as I experienced last night, as I've already said, is people simply sharing testimony. What would it mean in your carol service for you as the pastor not to preach for half an hour, but to ask a scientist in your congregation just to give a testimony of what they see in Jesus and how it's affected their lives? And then you can preach for 25 minutes. How powerful that would be, just so that people witness to Jesus. And so weaving through the carols and weaving through all of the readings, what about a word of testimony from a couple of people, short, sharp, and then for the pastor to use that in weaving into a message that she or he is talking about. I think that's what my advice would be.
Thank you, David. And I've got so many more questions, but we will stop and let people get on with their present wrapping or sermon prep or whatever they need to do. But I will recommend this book, which was published quite some time ago, but which
A long time ago.
I go to. You can see how crumpled the spine is on my copy. This goes through David's commentary goes through all the main passages about aspects of creation that tend to come up in your mind when people ask questions about science and faith. Colossians 1, Hebrews 1, Psalm 8, Psalm 19, Genesis 1 to 3, Job. It's all in here, short commentary on each passage. I go to it again and again and again and again whenever I preach on these kinds of passages. So I do thoroughly recommend that book. Thank you, David, and for all your other contributions ongoing on this topic. I will flag up the ECLAS project, the Engaging Christian Leadership in an Age of Science, and their website and all their resources there. So thank you so much, David. It's been fantastic chatting with you.
Always good to talk to you, Ruth, and thanks for all that you're doing.
Thank you. Great. So if our audience want to explore more, take a look at the ECLAS website, but also at our Advent page on the Faraday Churches webpage or on patreon.com//Faraday Churches. Have a look out there for events and podcasts happening next year. And finally, if you want to be part of the Faraday Churches network, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter or weekly WhatsApp. And for details of all these things, please go to Faraday.institute/churches. See you next time.
Thank you, Ruth. Bye-bye.
Bye.